to discuss many interesting things. I'm going to talk a bit about what satellite images can tell us about conflict, or what we can find out about conflicts from looking at satellite images. And I will use 3 cases from Iraq and Syria that I've been working on. So the first case is about land use and agriculture in the areas that the Islamic State or Daesh took over in 2015. And this is a paper that I published last year, so it's not really that new, but I mean it's an interesting case that I would like to bring up. And then we'll move on to talk a bit about the drought, migration, conflict narrative in Syria, and what studies of land use can tell us about that. And then the last part is something that's quite new, that I just started a few months ago, to look at the conflict effects on forest and other vegetated areas in Iraqi Kurdistan. So we'll start with the data that I use, and this is a simplified way of describing it, but I'm using something that I call phenology, or that is called phenology, which relates to the season of vegetation and animals. And so, for example, when the leaves are changing colors in autumn, that's phenology, that's a phenological thing. And I look at the phenology of croplands. So if you have an agricultural field, it will usually be really, in winter, I mean, you have snow covers, you don't really see it, and then it becomes green when the snow melts and there's more water, rainfall, and then it peaks sometime in this case around March, April and May, and then after that you have a harvest period. So much of the land is harvested in a really short period, and then it decreases quite quickly again. So this is the yellow line that you can see in the chart. That's cropland with one harvest. There's also a red line, a red-brown line. That's cropland that's harvested twice, or that has 2 seasons. You see one that goes at the same time as the yellow line, and then there's one that comes later in summer. And if you compare that with non-cropland vegetation or more natural vegetation, you can see that that's the green line that I have in the chart, and that has a much later peak, and the peak is not as high, and then it doesn't decrease as much in the summer. So they are behaving differently in time, depending on what type of land use you have. And then you have the gray line at the bottom, and that's bare soil, where you have almost no vegetation at all. And so on the y-axis here is a measure of greenness that's called NVI, Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, that can be measured by satellite images, or recorded in satellite images. And that's used a lot for studying vegetation from space. So this is my land use data set that I, together with colleagues, put together over 17 years, so from 2000 until 2016. So I have every year where is the cropland, where is the non-cropland vegetation, and where is the bare soil. It's quite coarse, but it's very useful when you want to study the year-to-year changes. So this is what it looks like, and this is a map of the most common land use class, or land cover class. So in the cropland areas, the yellow areas, you see that this is where the most common class per year is cropland. So it gets you an idea of what type of land cover you have in Syria and Iraq. So the first study I did with this data set, and what I actually developed this data set for, was to look at the territory that ISIS or IS or Daesh or whatever they're called, this area that they took over in 2015. And you can see that those are the gray areas in the map. And I wanted to know what happens to agriculture, and I suggested to a friend who was really, he knew a lot about ISIS, and he was following their developments. And I asked him if he knew anything about agriculture, and maybe we could do something together to look at agriculture, just out of curiosity, like what's going on. So we did, and we developed this data set. We found, just briefly, what we found was that many areas actually saw cropland gains. So if you compare a reference period of 2000 till 2013, which was before the IS took over areas, with 2015, which was the only year that we had at the time that was actually under IS control, we saw lots of areas that had seen gains. So these are the blue areas in the maps, actually bare soil that had been turned into cropland. And it may be that these areas had been cropland before, but not all of those years during the reference period. So that was one finding, but we also found cropland losses in certain areas, and those are the red dots, but they are not as extensive, and you can't really see a pattern where they are, but of course they are there. The yellow areas show stable cropland that didn't change, and this was the most common thing we found, that areas remained cultivated or active. And then another interesting thing we saw was that there was a change from this cropland with 2 harvests to cropland with only 1 harvest or 1 season. And we saw that both in the ISIS zones, but we saw that even more outside in the other parts of the countries. So we said that this might mean that in the ISIS zone it's easier to access the materials needed to maintain this kind of more high intensity agriculture than outside in other parts, which, these Syria and Iraq are also, affected by conflict, so it's not only that things are happening in the ISIS zone, it's actually like lots of other things. We just use ISIS as a lens to look at it. So that's a really short presentation of this paper, but you can go and read it, and there's even a short video clip about it that we had to make for the journal. So the next study that I'm working on right now is satellite perspective on the drought, migration, conflict narrative in Syria that I think many people have heard about or followed a bit. So according to the narrative, and this is not the only narrative, but it's one very prominent narrative, states that there was a drought in 2007 until 2009. The years changed a bit depending on who you ask and how you define drought, but around that time there was a drought. This drought led to an agricultural collapse, according to many sources. And this agricultural collapse in turn led to migration of people from rural areas to cities, which was part of a reason for the uprising that started in 2011. So I focus on a small part of this narrative. I want to know if agriculture really collapsed, in the sense of like a really big shift in the way that the agricultural system works. And some signs of that would be to look for land abandonment, that large areas are not being used anymore. So I look at land activity change based on this data set that I have to learn more about it. And this is what we find. There's a lot of information in this picture, but you can focus on the chart to the left, the one that says A. This is where I compare active and fallow cropland per year. So in all of Syria, how much of the land is active and how much of the land is fallow. And this is focusing only on areas that are usually used for cropland. So I've removed the ones that are sometimes used for cropland and sometimes not, but the most frequently cropped areas. And we see that in 2008, which was the main drought year, less than 50% of the cropland was actually active. So it's a sign of how the drought affected cultivated areas. But then in 2009, you see some recovery, and in 2010, you have a really high share of cropland that is active again. And if we go to the maps in the bottom, you see where these changes are happening. So in 2007, most areas are yellow, it's active. 2008, you see that in the northeast, in Al-Hasaka, you have a strong decrease in cropland, or active cropland. And in 2009, again, you see a recovery in the northern part of the Al-Hasaka governorate, which corresponds to the areas in the big map where you have high intensity cropland. So this is probably the most, like the best cropland areas that you really want to cultivate. And then in 2010, like you can barely see any black areas. So like a large share of the area is cultivated again. Now I know that in 2010 there was a yellow rust disease outbreak in Syria and in Iraq as well, I think. And I don't know exactly where that is because I haven't seen any maps of it. But even if we think about that, and I mean that probably had an effect on the farmers' livelihoods, but still in 2010 the land was probably sown. I mean it looks like it was sown and it was harvested. Maybe they couldn't use the harvest, but it was active. I think what happened in 2008 was not that people didn't sow the land because they couldn't have known what kind of season it would be. But I think this is a crop failure. So because of the lack of rainfall that you can see in this chart to the right, the crops didn't grow properly. So it was a crop failure. In 2009, I don't know if it was, less areas were sown because there was a lack of seeds or people were not there. Maybe there was this migration to cities, but maybe, I mean, it probably was temporary, which is also something that's been found when you've done interviews with people in rural areas, that there's always this temporary circular migration going on where people migrate to cities to find jobs. So basically what I want to say with this study is that if we claim that agriculture is an important link in the climate conflict nexus, you need to look into agriculture more and see what's actually going on and what can we learn about it. You can't just say that there was an agricultural collapse. You need to first define the collapse, what does it mean, and then did it really happen like that? And I think in the case of Syria, there was no good evidence of a collapse in the way that I define collapse. I mean, times were probably bad, and I can compare to the drought that we had in Sweden this year, where like people were suffering, farmers were suffering because of the lack of rainfall. So I can imagine it was really bad in Syria as well. But I don't see any evidence of collapse or abandonment. And I think that provides an interesting piece of the puzzle to this bigger narrative about climate and conflict. So the last case study is something I just started, so I don't really have a conclusion for it, but I have a start and I'm going to tell you about it. So the story goes like this, that in Iraqi Kurdistan, because of the war on ISIS, there was less protection of natural areas because forest rangers had to move to the front lines to fight secure the borders. And this meant that forests became accessible to people. And at the same time, or in the aftermath of that, there were fuel shortages as an effect of political issues between the Kurdistan regional government and the Iraqi government. And these shortages have led to illegal logging, so people are cutting down trees to heat their houses in the winter. These are from media reports, some really short narratives that I found. And then there has also been forest fires that are both attributed to climate, high temperatures and conflicts. So I wanted to look into this and see if my data set could actually show us something about this. The problem is that my data set was developed to find cropland areas. That's what I was interested in. But now I'm using the non-cropland vegetation class to see if I can get some information out of it. And I asked the question of how much of the 2000 till 2013 non-cropland vegetation, which includes tree lands, trees, forested areas, but also pastures and both trees and plants and different things. But also orchards, so it's not completely non-agricultural. It has both anthropogenic and more natural areas in it. But I wanted to see if there has been a change that corresponds to these media reports. And I do see that in 2014, most of these non-cropland vegetation areas are maintained, so there hasn't been a big change. And the changes that we see, we don't know if it's because of classification variations or if it's actually changed. But in 2015 and 16, you see a change of between 18 and 20%, which is quite a large change. So only 80% of the non-cropland vegetation is maintained. 20% is changed to cropland, according to my classification. And you see the red areas in this map is where those changes happened in 2016. So, this is basically where I'm at. I can see that there has been a large change in non-cropland vegetation to cropland vegetation. And the next steps for me would be to verify those changes and make sure that what my data is actually saying is correct, so that there's not any problems in the data and something that doesn't make sense. And then, after that, it's relevant to combine this information with other information. So in these media reports, for example, I want to know like where are these things happening, and can I see it on the map from my data? And also look at forest fire data to see if that's one of the drivers. So, to conclude, I think that satellite data can be useful in the studies of conflict. I would like to say that it provides an objective perspective, but since you have to interpret the data, you can't really say that it's objective. It's depending on who is looking at the images. But I think it can be useful for verification, and especially of these reports for media and different groups that have an interest in this. So it answers questions of where, when, and how much, but we cannot know who and why, and that's what we need the contextual information for. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Lina. We have time for 1 or 2 questions.
First of all, thank you so much for just 2 quick questions. First of all, can you identify type of agriculture? Because you mentioned double and one, but can you identify, for example, rice has a 2-season cycle. Can you identify this from non-2 type cycle? Because you mentioned Daesh that might have changed the type of what they're growing, and not just because of something changed about the material.
Yeah, I mean, you can maybe do that. I haven't really tried to go into detail because it's really difficult. But you can look at, to some extent, you can find out when are things harvested. You can see that, like where the change happens. And like look at crop calendars, but it's quite hard to know exactly what type of crop it is, and to distinguish, for example, between wheat and barley. It's really hard.
The second remark, maybe you can use prices as a kind of proxy to changes in amount of agriculture. I mean, if there's a shortage, the
Mm.
prices would at least theoretically go up.
Mm.
Maybe it's,
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Just a quick question.
Yes, I wondered if the theory of climate change and agriculture in Syria, maybe instead of only looking at rainfall, maybe damming and river management
Mm.
and migration, because I think there is a pattern of migration to the cities which may have empowered the rebel movement, and maybe it's not exactly the rainfall, but it's something else in the water availability.
Yeah, I think it could be, and I mean, migration has many complex reasons, so it's hard to say that one thing is the reason, but for sure, yeah.
Just a point, thank you. Would you consider, you referred to Syria 2007-2009, consider continuing the study after the civil war in Syria since 2011?
Yes, I have that in my plans, but trying to divide it up into different, because it's so complex.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.